This will be a sort of halfway planned Saturday ramble, but it's still going to be a little bit of ramble. And what I'm saying is a little bit of ramble may turn into a lot of ramble. We'll see. You know how I am. But just a couple of things that have come up during the week that I just made some notes about and thought it'd be interesting to pass along. One, just to catch up on where I'm at with the Orky flyer. I'm in the middle, well, I'm almost to the end of filming the painting video. And I think I talked about that, I'm imagining this, okay, if it were painted by actual orcs, if it was a real thing, painted in an actual universe with actual orcs that behave like orcs behave. And so I try to be a little, not, I don't want to say clever, but I imagine it, and truly this is the way I'm doing it. In the video I described that I imagine there's these three different orcs painting it, and they're using three different methods. And so I use, I use three different colors for them. In my mind, as I was painting them, I was actually, this is, maybe it's childlike, but I'm okay with that. I was actually imagining, okay, what if these orcs, there were real orcs just, standing or on their hands and knees or whatever, painting this thing, and I was, when I was off camera, I'm like painting them and I'm trying to, I just thought it was funny. And so I'm like, I'm painting the airplane. Yep, I'm painting the airplane. Just imagining, okay, what would it look like if orcs were painting it? But anyway, this is what it's looking like so far. And I've put on some metallics. The only thing I've got left to do is there's a few areas, just a few spot areas that I want to do some black color in. So I'm going to film that. And probably later today's Saturday, June 3rd. And it's already June. How did that happen? But get the video done, and I may release it next week. I may wait another week. I don't know. As I get more comfortable with this no schedule thing, I'm getting comfortable with just going, I'll wait a few days. So plus, just to go ahead and give you a heads up, and I'll write more about this. We're going to be taking some vacation to go see the grandsons towards the beginning of July, June 30th to July 9th. We're going to be traveling or with them. So I'm not, those two Saturdays, unless I just happen to shoot something to put on a scheduled release for patrons, you won't see anything from me then. And there may not be anything even the week after I get back because I won't have filmed anything. So there's going to be a period where basically I'm going to be taking some vacation at the beginning of July. So just a heads up that's coming. But this project is proving to be really fun. Now I'm really excited about. I'm not sure if it will be the next in the series or the next in the series. This will be the second in the series, so I'm not sure if this one that I'm fixing to talk about is going to be the third or the fourth in the series. I still haven't decided, but I'm going to be doing one on oils, using oil paints. And I'll go ahead and tell you, I plan on it being long. I want to keep it my goal is to keep it under an hour. That's it. But I want it to be a very fully orbed video about using oils, because so many people tell me they want to use oils, but they don't understand some of it, or they're not sure because they've never done it, and so they're a little intimidated by making use of them. And what I want to do is I want to do something that's complete enough that it will take the mystery out of using oils. So that's my hope. It's a big goal. And I want to use them fairly comprehensively, not just for panel lines, but for staining, for all sorts of stuff. So I'm looking forward to applying these on this one because I think this will I think this will look really cool with some oils on it. Okay, this is just going to be me talking about a future project. I've already talked about it a little bit before, but the kit that I've decided to use, remember I talked about using that Torox Prime. I think I had talked about using it as kind of a beginner build to kind of show, okay, you've got the parts on the sprue. Here's how you clip them off. Here's how you clean them up. Here's how you plan the build. Here's how you put it together. Here's a simple, just basically take a model from sprue to completion in one episode and show all of the detail, all of the steps in some regard. I was going to use that Torox Prime for that because it fits a lot of things that I wanted to do. It's a simple, small kit, easy to build, quite cool looking. The paint job would be fairly simple. But then I got to looking back at the one that I had previously built, and I thought, man, this thing's got a really nice interior in it. And I've got a resin set to replace the treads, the tracks that it rides around on with wheels. And it gives it a whole different look. And so I thought, that would be better to do an episode about painting the interior and making it look really good, and maybe building on the knowledge that I would have done with the Orc Flyer to show, okay, here's another application of oils. May or may not do that, but show, okay, building the interior of it because it's such a nice interior, and then do something talking about working with resin. I've done that before, but I still get questions on it. And even with the video that I previously did with the wheeled Chimera, I get questions that kind of, okay, that gives me an opportunity to answer those in a video. So I realized I think the Torox would be better as a probably 3-part series. I don't want to stretch it too far, but a 3-part series of the interior, working with resin, and then painting the exterior and all of that, and doing it in a Tempestus cyan color scheme. If you've ever watched the old Warhammer TV, Duncan Rhodes did a 2-part series on painting that, and that's basically what I want to copy. I want to paint it just like he did. I loved that video, and I want to use those same colors and weather it up, and because I've just always wanted to do that. So that's what I'm going to be doing for that basic build. Or that's what I'm not going to be using the Torox. This is how forgetful I am. I already forgot the point that I was making. This is why I ramble for 45 minutes. So I'm not going to be using the Torox Prime for the basic build. What I am going to use is I ordered a kit called a Razorback. Now, if you know 40K, you know what it is. If you don't, a Razorback is a rhino with a big gun. What is a rhino? A rhino is an APC, Armored Personnel Carrier. Now, the reason I decided to switch to, I'm actually going to build the rhino for the video. I'm not going to build, I may build the rhino for the video, but using magnets, I may end up with the ability to switch to both. And if I magnetize it and do all that, I'll show all of that for patrons. The rest will be just a basic build, because I'll be able to fake it with making it look like a rhino. But anyway, a rhino it's still fairly small. It's it's only about this big. It's a box. It's a box with tracks. I'm not going to have any figures sticking out on it to keep it a simple build. It has a nice interior, but quite honestly, I've done the interior several times. I've done blog articles about it. I did a Patreon video about painting the interior. So I feel like I've already covered the interior of the rhino. So I'm just going to button it up. I'm going to mention in the video, hey, if you want to paint the interior, now would be the time to do it. Not button it up and go. Because it will be a fairly simple build. When it's done, it's mainly just a box. I mean, yeah, it's got some, doors and, some features on it, but there's not a lot of complicated painting surfaces. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint it in the blue ultramarine colors, which it comes on the box, because blue is a good covering color, so it'll be easy to paint on there. And I'm just going to give it a very much Games Workshop TV style treatment when it comes to painting. Put on the base coat, do some dry brushing, do some shades, paint in some details, call it done. The whole point will be to take it from, on the sprue to completely finished, and it'll be a good looking model. I'll put decals on it. I'll do all of that stuff. But because of its shape and because it's a fairly simple model to build, it won't be intimidating in terms of, like, even with the Torox, there are certain things like the exhausts that you probably want to leave off. It has so many weapons options that I realized I may want to do a lot of magnetizing there. The Rhino, for the most part, if I decide not to build it as a Razorback, if I just plan to glue it all together with very little on it, it'll still work, and importantly, it'll still sell afterwards. So I can maybe make my money back on purchasing the kit. So I'll be using a Rhino for that project, and I'm kind of excited about it because I've been wanting to build one of those. I think they're a very basic kit, but they're one of my favorites to build because they are so simple and because they do have a lot of options. And I've mentioned before, they remind me of riding around in M113s in Somalia. The Americans that I worked with did not use them, but we worked with various UN forces, the ones that I remember in particular, Pakistani. I found a photo that, it's not one that I took. This is one I found on the web, but it's of the M113s of the type that I rode around in. It'll get your attention when you're riding around inside of that thing and it's hot and dusty and crowded, and you never know if there's going to be an RPG ripping through the wall to ruin your day. But hey, it's part of my life, something I did. But that APC idea has always been something that's kind of drawn me to it because I can really relate to that. So I thought it would just be a good all-around basis for that. It's supposed to arrive today. I was hoping I was going to have it in time to actually show it, but it did not happen. So I don't mind rambling about it, though. So you know me, I'll ramble about anything. Okay, one of the topics that I want to talk about and actually demonstrate, and if you're still watching, you're thinking, good, he's finally getting to a point. Sorry. Somebody watched. I get comments all the time. Well, I say all the time like I'm this hugely popular channel, like I'm getting millions of comments. I get a couple of comments a day on old videos, and I'm grateful for comments. I like when people leave comments. If you've ever thought, I don't know if I should leave a comment because I don't know if John cares, I love getting comments. I try to answer them quickly. I don't always have the opportunity to because sometimes I'm at work, but I try to answer them quickly, and I love getting comments because I love knowing that people are finding the videos useful. So if you've ever thought about, should I leave a comment or not, please, I love hearing from folks in the comments. But somebody watched one of my old videos about priming models, and they were just asking about can you hand brush Badger Stynel Res primer? And I guess this would apply to Vallejo primers, acrylic primers, not the rattle cans, but acrylic primers. And I was explaining to him that yes, you can, and here's some thoughts on it. And he asked, do you need to thin this? And I said, no, you don't need to thin it. Just use it right out of the bottle. So it's something that I've had enough questions about that I thought, well, I'll demonstrate it. One, because there are questions that come up from time to time, and two, to take up some time in the video. But I've got this League of Votan figure here. It's a really cool sculpt. He's got his, he's got this, almost space marine kind of armor thing going there, but then he's got this duster coat like, a Clint Eastwood Western. And then he's got his, his laser gun that I still have to drill out the barrels. I know, drill out the barrels, John. And then he's got this cool sword, so there's going to be a lot of painting possibilities there. I liked this one. Normally I don't always glue the arms on, but this one, because it's opened up, I went ahead and glued them on. I did leave the head off to paint it separately. I just left him on a bit of sprue, and I can clamp that with something and hold on to it. And then his backpack, I left it off because it's got this hose that runs around under his arm and connects up here at the collar. It'll be easy to put on at the end. I'll just say if I ever paint this. This is one of those that's just sitting around waiting to be painted if the whim ever hits me. And I left the backpack off just to make it easy to get to various parts of the model without having to fight the backpack. So, but when it comes to hand priming, yes, you can hand prime with those acrylic primers, and it works very well. You just have to make sure, like with applying any other paint, you have to make sure not to put it on so thick that it's going to clog things up. And the great thing about primer is acrylic paint doesn't adhere well to plastic. Now, I could paint directly onto this with acrylic paint, and aside from it, as long as I didn't touch it while I was working on it, which would pretty certainly rub off paint, I could paint it completely and set it on my shelf, and it would last for years. Now, if you're using it for a game piece and you're going to be picking up and holding it and touching it and all of that, it's going to wear that paint right off. Even with primer, you can still wear the paint off, but the primer is designed to stick to the plastic better than paint, and then paint will stick to the primer. You don't have to have a completely opaque layer of primer for the paint to stick. You just want something on there. So brush painting it, even if it's kind of patchy, is just fine. So let me get that prepared and show you how I do that. Now, I'm using just Badger Stynylrez black primer. There are several benefits to using acrylic primers. Now, I always, if you're airbrushing, wear a respirator. No exceptions. I don't care what you're spraying. Wear a respirator. Acrylics, enamels, lacquers, wear a respirator, because even though this is water-based, the acrylic stuff that's in it, when it's atomized, you don't want that going in your lungs. That would be a bad day. And by mask, I don't mean one of those masks like we wore during COVID. I mean a proper respirator with the two things on the side so that, you breathe and sound like Darth Vader. A proper respirator mask. And you're still going to want to be in a well-ventilated area. You're still going to want to have, if you can, an extraction fan. But at a minimum, wear that respirator. That is critical. Now, this stuff generally airbrushes on nicely, although lately I've been having a lot of people contact me and say that it's beating up and having problems with them, and I'm wondering if Badger has had some manufacturing issues. I've had a couple of colors, because I have quite a few bottles of it, and like this one is red-brown primer, and a few of the bottles that I've had trouble with that. But this black is an older one, and it works just fine through an airbrush. The problem with Stynylrez through an airbrush is, and this is really an issue with just acrylics in general, but Stynylrez in particular, it's a bear to clean up out of the airbrush. It's not impossible. The process I use takes me about 10 to 15 minutes, but that's a long cleanup time to clean up through an airbrush. And so more and more I use rattle cans because I can go out in the garage, I can open the door up, throw my mask on, put a rubber glove on my part holding hand, and just I can have something primed in just a couple of minutes, and then I just put the lid on the can and I'm done. But sometimes, because of the weather or because of the subject, I do want to put a primer coat on it, and I may want a particular color or whatever. And so I go with Stynylrez and I just deal with the cleanup. But like I said, you can brush paint this on, which means you don't have to clean your airbrush. And as much as I used to love using an airbrush, I'm finding myself more and more reluctant to do so. Not because I don't like it. I do. It's just because of the cleanup. So here's a lazy way of getting something primed, and it works just fine. Now, it works better on smaller things. You can do it on larger things. It just takes, you start losing some of the time savings that you would get over airbrushing, because, even with the cleanup, if you got a larger something and you're using this through an airbrush, you'll be able to get it primed fairly quickly, and then you'll spend time in cleanup. If you're trying to do something large with hand brushing it, it's just going to take a lot of time. So you kind of have to evaluate what's more valuable to you. But for a figure like this, brush painting it is very easy, and I think I'm going to be using it more and more as I do figures. Now the process is simple enough. One, you want to make sure that you've shaken up, and if you have a stir tool, stir this stuff up really good, because it needs to be fully mixed when you're priming. And then I just pop the lid open, which with my arthritis is getting more increasingly difficult. And then you can see there's some gunk on that has dried on it. But I just pour this into my palette like that. Don't thin Stynylrez primer. Period. Don't thin it. Don't thin it with water. Don't thin it with thinning solution. Don't thin it with, if you want to thin it with more Stynylrez primer. You can mix colors. That's really the stuff. Even airbrushing, it's a little thick to go in your airbrush. I know that's why it has trouble cleaning up. But if you thin it, it loses its properties that make it a good acrylic primer. So don't thin it. But anyway, I just get a brush like this, and I usually go for an older synthetic brush. And I just start this dabbing technique like this, and just putting that on like that. Now, as you'll see, it's not super great coverage in terms of opacity, but it's getting enough primer on there that paint can adhere to it. Now, just like with paint, I tend to do 2 thin coats. Again, not so much for opacity, but just to make sure there's enough surface that the paint that I put on is going to stick to. And it dries fairly fast, so usually by the time I get through going all around a model like this, by the time I get done, the place that I started is going to be dry, and I can go on. Now on flat surfaces like this, you can paint it on like that. This stuff levels out much better than most acrylic paints. I remember one time, I've been blessed that the president of Badger, Ken Schlotfeld, is a friend of mine. I got to know him many years ago when they came out with the Badger Patriot airbrush. At the time, my primary website was a Christian modeling website called Agape Models. And Ken is a Christian also. And he saw that and thought it was really cool and just contacted me out of the blue and said, hey, we're coming out with this Badger Patriot airbrush, and would you like an advanced copy of it? No charge. You don't even have to mention us. Just would you like, I mean, he just gave it to me with no strings attached. Of course, I jumped on that, and we got to know each other. I actually did an interview on my old website with him talking about Badger and his company and all of that. And the airbrush that I got was actually an early, not quite prototype, but an early production model that later models differed from. And so it was kind of unique. And as far as I know, I was the first one to actually demonstrate that airbrush because he had given it to me so early in the process. So I was real grateful for that. But anyway, boy, I could talk about a tangent. I had to think there, what the heck was I talking about in the first place? Anyway, I told Ken that Stynylrez primer could just be good paint because it goes on easy. And I mean, you can see I'm not being particularly careful, but 2 coats of this will generally give you some decent opacity. And Badger does make a line of paints. And they're designed for gamers. I've used them. They're not bad paints, and in fact, they're a great value because each bottle is only a few bucks, and it's like a large. I want to say like it's like 2 or 3 times the size of a Vallejo bottle, but for about the same price. So they're decent paints. It's just not a really wide range, and one of the main reasons I've not used it is I try to use products that people can easily find, and it's something you just have to order directly from them unless you just happen to find a shop that carries it. So that's why you don't see me using it. I think I did a vlog a long time ago talking about it. But anyway, you see as I've been rambling. Now, I haven't done the base yet. I'll get that. But you can see I've almost finished with getting this painted. And I've not been careful or neat or anything like that. The only thing I've done is I've just kind of kept things moving to make sure that there's no bad blobs that will create a problem. And you can see that amount of coverage right there, I may not need to put anything else on. Look, oops, I missed an area right here, the back of the leg. But this is another reason I like brush priming like this. It's just so easy. You miss a place, you just go back and do it. You don't have to reload the airbrush. I don't know how many times I've primed a model with the airbrush, and I would bring it back in here, and I would look and go, how did I miss, the back of one entire leg, or, the underside of the gun, or, just some angle or area that I'm like, I don't even know how I missed that. And I can come in with this stuff and just dab it on like that. But when it dries, it's going to be very smooth. Will it be as smooth as an airbrush application? No. Brush painting never is. Will it be smooth enough for good painting that you won't have any problems? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would never hesitate. I mean, if I did, not that I ever do, if I ever did entertain the idea of entering something like Golden Demon or whatever, I wouldn't have any problem with brush painting on the primer. I'm confident enough in it that it would work that way. So you see, I just slop it on, and down here on the base, because I'm not as worried about texture, you can just rough it on there real quick. But this, to me, is a very satisfying process. Sorry, I'm getting off camera, out of focus there. It's a very satisfying process. It's a very peaceful process. It's very easy because when I'm done, all I've got to do is clean my brush off. And I can guarantee you, if I would have airbrushed this it would have taken me about as long, or maybe even longer, most of which would have been spent in cleaning, to get this primed. So this is a perfectly acceptable way of doing it. Just put it on like you see me doing it. Get you a big old synthetic brush that's seen better days. And there's no way I would use one of my Kolinsky brushes, because there's no point in using a Kolinsky brush with this. It's just, it's just too rough a technique. But there, it's primed. It's pretty quick, pretty easy, fairly painless. And that's a sufficient prime for paint to go over. One other thought as I'm finishing up priming his head. You see I just used this little clamp here to hold that, and then serendipitously I figured out that the end of this pterodactyl clip fits right in there perfectly. Oops, there's a place I missed right there, and I can just go back and do that, easy enough. But it fits right in there, so that's a perfect little holder for that. But one of the great things about doing brush priming is you can rough in different colors. When you're airbrush priming or your rattle can priming, you pretty much got to, unless you're doing a zenithal prime. I'm washing my brush off, that's why I'm talking, but you don't see anything. You can, like I could prime this with an airbrush and then do the whole zenithal prime thing, and that works fine. But if, let's say you've got two areas that are completely different colors and you want to paint them on the same figure, it's kind of hard to do that with an airbrush primer, and it's certainly impossible with a rattle can primer. But with this brush priming, I'm having trouble speaking. Let's say there were parts of this model that I wanted to paint, that I wanted to prime with, say, another color like this brown here. I could have primed those parts with the brown and then gone back and painted in the primer over the top of that in areas where I wanted it to be black. So you could end up with your model reasonably close to base coated with primer, and have very different areas. You could have areas that are white, like if you wanted this sword to be, if you wanted it to be primed in a much lighter color, so that you can, make it look more saturated. I could have taken my white primer and primed that and the coils of the gun, and then primed everything else in black, and it would have worked just fine. One other thought, you can use a hair dryer to dry this, but I've found sometimes you can get, it will cause areas where the primer would normally level. If it dries too fast, you may end up with some little blobs here and there, or it can cause it to pull back from edges. One thing about the brush painting that you have to watch is sometimes around edges, the primer will pull back. Like, I think that's what happened right here. I may have just forgotten to do that, but there can be just a few places, like, see right along here on the sword, it just pulled back from that edge a little bit. Now that I've got a very thin coat of the primer on there, I can go put another one on there. And now I've got, now it's built up to full opacity, but now it's sticking to those edges because it had something to stick to. So sometimes you do have to do a second application. But again, it's real easy because you're just, you just got it in your palette here. And I would not use a wet palette for this. I would not recommend doing that because, again, you're adding water, and that's not going to be something that you want to do. I need to go and I just realized I need to make the inside of the coat a fully opaque coat of black, because I'm not going to paint the inside of it because it's more difficult to reach. So I just want it to be in shadow. But anyway, that's just some final thoughts on this. Okay, now another figure, another opportunity to prime. But this time, I want to show you something that if you have these sitting around, you can use as primer, and that is lacquer paint. Now, it doesn't have to be the Mr. Hobby brand, although this is probably the best lacquer paint for it. If you ever use Mr. Surface or 1500, 1500, whatever, it's from the same manufacturer, and chemically they're very, very, very similar. They're thinned with something like Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, which is a lacquer-based thinner. That adheres to plastic really, really well. Honestly, it adheres better than Stynylrez. So if you have bottles of this already, or you know a store where you can easily get them, this can be a great way to prime smaller models or even larger models. The distinction I make when I tell people about priming this, a lot of people like to prime and then sand to work out any imperfections, but I think there's some misconceptions. Let me go on a rabbit trail, and I know this video is already going long, but you know me. Oh well. Hopefully you consider this getting your value. But a lot of people go, "Oh, Mr. Surface is a micro filler." I think a lot of people overrate how much micro you can fill with Mr. Surfacer when you're using it as a primer. Now, certainly you can use it as a gap filler, but you got to really blob it in there. You got to do a whole different technique. When you airbrush it on, when it's talking about being a micro filler, it's talking about really, really, really fine surface blemishes. If you can visibly see scratches from where you sanded something, that's too much for Mr. Surfacer to really take care of. My rule of thumb is if the model needs to have a smooth finish, you don't get it through primer. You get it through sanding the plastic. Sanding and polishing the plastic. When you can look at the plastic and hold it in light and move it around, and you see that surface is very glossy, then you know you've smoothed it out. And when you put primer on it, it's going to be a good prime. Like if you're doing if you're airbrushing on some all-clad or some kind of metallic finish like that, yeah, you can use all-clad primer and it will fill very, very fine scratches because they will show up in a metallic finish. But like I said, too many people look at it and they do something. They go, "Why wasn't my model smooth?" And I'm like, because you use the primer to do something it's not designed to do. Get it smooth before you put on the primer. But if you've already got it smooth and you've got some of this around, this is a great way to prime. Let me show you. Now, lacquer paints smell, but if you're using them in a well-ventilated area, let me get this stirred up. If you're using them in a well-ventilated area, I don't put on my respirator because it's not atomized paint. It's stanky paint, but it's not atomized. Now, if you're in a closed area, if there's not adequate airflow, I'm in a large room with a ceiling fan. There's airflow, the AC is on, all of that stuff. So I'm not as worried about it. Plus, it's hard to talk when you have the mask on. But I stir it up, and then I get it, and I just put some in my palette like that. And that's probably more than I need. It's way more than I need, but oh well. I don't use this stuff that often. Now, this is something, if you're going to airbrush a primer on, this is something that cleanup is super easy, and it works really great. So sometimes when I want to airbrush, I actually just go and grab. If you ever hear me say I airbrush primed the model in black, but I don't talk about a brand, it's probably because I'm using something like this. Because using this requires much more of an explanation. And if the main point is, okay, I primed it in black, that's the main thing. Now, what I've got in this little bottle, and you can not even really see that it says MCLT, Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. And I keep that in here. I've had this in this bottle for years. I've used this bottle for years. One time I used it on camera and somebody said, you shouldn't use that bottle like that because it will eat right through it. And I'm like, okay, it's been in here. Literally, I've been using this bottle for 10 years or more. I think it's going to be okay. But I put in the thinner, spill some there. And there's no correct proportion. I'm going to grab another brush that's dry so I don't want any water in it. And I'm going to stir it around like that. And if you've ever watched Lincoln write, you know that all I'm doing is painting with lacquers here, like he'll demonstrate. But it's fairly thin, but what you're looking for is just a consistency that goes on kind of like that. Now, the beauty of lacquer paints is they self-level even better than, say, Stynylrez or something like that. So you can go on and put this on here like this. Just the same. The application method is the same as I did before. I just put it on just like that. And this will dry fairly quick. And because there's so many colors, you can paint your model with this. You got to be careful with the technique. And I wouldn't recommend painting minis with lacquers, and I'll go into that why in just a second. But you can see I can put this on and very quickly, and it's going to dry, and it's going to dry smooth. And acrylic paints will adhere to this really, really well. And it's going to give you a very durable prime. And, you can get all the colors you want. And, if you're like me, if you're a former military builder, former aircraft builder, you may have a bunch of these paints sitting around and think, well, what can I make use of? Because these paints last forever. But it goes on real easy like that. I would not recommend using Tamiya acrylics for this. They work okay, but even when thinned with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, because they are very matte, they tend to impart a little bit of texture. These tend to dry a little glossier, satiny, glossy, and so they provide a very smooth finish. Now, one thing to keep in mind if you are using lacquers never cure. They only dry. There's a distinction between those two things. So I can leave this paint, I can let this paint dry in this palette. I've done this before. I can let it dry in this palette and literally come back a month later, drop in some lacquer thinner, and start using it again. You just reactivate it. So you have to be careful with applying coats, additional coats afterwards, because it will activate the paint layers below it. So once it is dry, like if you put on a second coat, you kind of, like, let's say I'm putting on a second coat. Let's pretend this area is already covered and I'm putting on a second coat. You just have to kind of put it on and not touch it again until it dries, because it's going to activate slightly the paints below that. That's why it works so good, because it just keeps, adhering to itself really well. It just melts itself. Now, what this also means is if you get an area that's a little thick, and if you see any bubbles form, those generally pop. If they don't, you can go in with just a touch of thinner and get rid of them. Got a stray hair there. But just be aware that it reactivates. So you don't want to overdo it if you're putting on a second coat or something like that. But once again, you don't have to have, like with the Stynylrez, you don't have to have complete 100% opacity if you don't want to. Just something that the acrylic paint can cling to. Now, why I chose this color for this guy, I don't know. I guess I need to do him as an Imperial Fist now or something. But it just happened to be the color that I grabbed. This is what you would use on the underside of a Spitfire. That's why I have it. So, but this stuff is going to dry It may not look smooth because it's textury in terms of visual texture, but it's actually going to be as smoother than the Stynylrez, Res, and it works really well. If the paint in your palette starts thickening up, just add a little more thinner to it. Remember, because it never cures, and it's not. It doesn't. You can touch it all you want once it's dry. It takes the thinner to reactivate it, but if it starts getting a little thick in your palette like that, just add some more thinner. You can work with this. You can work with the same thing of paint literally all day. I've seen Lincoln Wright do that in his Paint on Plastic channel, where he'll have some paints that he may have had in there for a couple of years, and he'll go, oh, that's close to what I'm going to use. So he'll just put his new paint on top of his old paint, and it makes a mix, and it's just, everything is just, its own unique mix. If you never watched Lincoln Wright Paint on Plastic, he does mostly Machine Krieger, does some sci-fi, did a really good Ghost Keel, and he's done some other 40K, and he's done Gunpla and all that, but now he's focusing almost entirely he's focusing entirely on Machining Krieger. He used to be a studio artist with Ko Yokoyama, who is the inventor of the Machining Krieger genre. But he's got some really interesting application techniques for doing stuff. But here's another way you can prime. All right, the final thing I want to talk about is these dropper bottles. Let me move this so I don't keep hitting it and going clank. Dropper bottles. Somebody contacted me this week and said, is it typically, the tip of the bottle had split, and they were asking, was it because they tightened their lid down too much? And I told them it's probably not the case. You may, from time to time, I've had this happen to me from time to time. This is a brand new bottle. When I just opened it right there, that was literally the first time. My wife got this for me last week at Hobby Lobby. But because I rarely go into town, but you may find these tips split, and when they're split, it's really annoying, because if you don't know that ahead of time, and you just grab it and shake it up, you get just inside the lid is just a load of paint. It's just a mess, and then when you try and put it on the palette, it's just a mess. Now, to alleviate that, what I did was I ordered off of Amazon some 17 milliliter replacement bottles. I eyeballed them, and they looked pretty much like these, and so I ordered them. They were cheap, and it turned out that these did fit. So if I find one that's split now, I just have some replacements to put in there. But what I do, here's what I recommend when it comes to shaking Vallejo paints. One, when you first get it, don't shake it, don't do anything with it. Open the bottle. One, make sure the tip's not split. I've noticed that it's not happening. There was a period a few years ago where it was like every third bottle I got was split. They seem to be better about it. I guess maybe they resourced the manufacturer. I don't know what they did, but it seems to be getting better. But one of the first things I do is I look for these old janky pliers here, and I just pull the lid off like that. And then I have a bag of these agitator balls. I got these on Amazon. I don't remember the size. Seems like they're 0.5 or 0.55 millimeter, 5.56. Yeah, I'm familiar with that size. And I just drop one or two in there in every new bottle. And then I put the lid back on. See that it already had some paint in the lid, so let me get that cleaned up. There, I just used some piece of tissue to clean that off, and I'll just wipe that off. When they're new, spillage is always an issue. Sometimes there's so much paint in there, it's hard to get it to shake up. There's times where I actually get frustrated with it and pour out, a little bit just to make it easier to shake up. Now, typically, you put the lid back on, you shake it up. But eventually, let me see if my old one here, eventually the inside of your lid starts looking like that. See, I just opened this thing up, and even though this thing is doggone near empty, there's paint coming up out of it. This had just been laying on its side too, so that can be part of it. But what I do is, instead of doing it that way, I open it up and I put my thumb over it. And then I just do my shaking. Now I actually have my vortex shaker over here, and excuse me, and I do the vortex thing first. But then I just put my thumb over it. Now I grip it pretty good. I get a little indent in my thumb, but the difference is when I shake it like this, and I shake it more than that, but when I shake it like that, I may get a spot of paint on here, but it doesn't get up into the lid, and it keeps the inside of the lid cleaner. Now, I only started doing this a few years ago, and this bottle of paint honestly has been around for probably 4 or 5 years. I only started doing this a couple of years ago because since it gets less paint in there, then it makes a better seal and the paint doesn't dry up. Not that Vallejo has a problem with drying up, but it just stores better. It makes it easier to get the lids, the bottle off. You can use a Q-tip to clean up any that's in there, because there will always be a little bit of paint in there, even when it's just sitting there. But that method of just putting your thumb over it and shaking it around like that is going to give you a much cleaner result than leaving the lid on. And even with my Too Thin Coats paints are nice because, for many reasons, but for one, they have a little, you can hardly see it, but you see where the black dot is. That's actually a little stopper that goes down into the paint nozzle. So when you close that, it's actually sealing it off much better, because it's got a plug in there. But some paint can still get around it. So even with these, I still do the thumb trick to get that thinned, or to get that shaken. So if you're using any of the shaker bottles, give that a try, and hopefully it will help your paints stay neater. One thing to remember, I had somebody tell me this. They said, I loved that advice. I put it to use. It works great. They said, but I'll just tell you from experience, don't ever forget to put your thumb over it. Because he said he just started shaking it, was squeezing it too hard, and he's looking around and there's paint flying everywhere. He was like, where's this paint coming from? Oh, I forgot to put my thumb over it. So yeah, putting your thumb over it is critical. All right, I know this has been a long ramble. I had not intended for it to go this long, but you guys know, and if you're the 4 or 5 of you at most who will still see this part, you know that I talk about this a lot. I want to be helpful, so I try to talk about as many things as I think will be helpful, as many things as I remember. So that's why these go long. I apologize that they're long, but I hope that they are helpful and useful for you. That's my main goal. That's always my main goal. And of course, as always, thank you for being a patron. Thank you for the support you give me. It keeps me modeling. I'm thankful for it. And please, if you ever want to contact me with questions, or just to talk models, whatever, please don't hesitate. Use that. I don't mind hearing from anybody, but I love hearing from patrons, because you guys are invested in this, and so that really means a lot to me, and I appreciate it. So thank you very much. And you know the rest. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. That always applies. So I will just sign off with saying, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.